You got a boathouse that's supposed to be your peaceful retreat, but suddenly, an HOA Karen decides it's hers. She moves in, claiming your property as her own, and refuses to leave. What do you do when your rights are ignored and someone's making your life a living nightmare? You take things into your own hands. But here's the twist. Instead of going through the usual channels, I did something wild, something that turned her world upside down. I set the boathouse adrift. But that's just the beginning. I've always loved my little lakeside cabin. It wasn't much, just a modest boathouse tucked away at the edge of Lake Serenity, but it was mine. And to me, it was more than just a structure. It was a place to escape, to breathe, and to be free. I spent countless weekends there, away from the stresses of work, enjoying the quiet, listening to the soft ripple of the water and the sound of birds overhead. No one bothered me there. Or at least, no one used to. That was until Karen. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was an HOA, Karen. Those people who think their word is law, who act like they own everything just because they hold a clipboard and have a badge that says President of the Homeowners Association. She had a way of looking down on anyone who didn't follow her idea of how things should be. To her, perfection wasn't just a goal, it was a rule. So when she started making waves about my boathouse, I had a feeling things were going to get ugly. But I didn't expect it to turn into a battle of wills. The boathouse wasn't just an ordinary property to me. It was my sanctuary. And to her, it was just another piece of the neighborhood puzzle to control. I was a quiet guy. I didn't usually cause a fuss. But when she decided to squat in my boathouse, pretending she had a right to be there, I knew I couldn't sit back anymore. She didn't just demand I let her in. No, she had the audacity to move in without asking. It was like I woke up one morning to find her drinking coffee on my dock, acting like she belonged there. I had a good life, a steady job, and a clear idea of how things should be, until Karen decided to show up and turn everything upside down. I wasn't going to let her bully me out of my own space. I had to find a way to make it clear that my boathouse wasn't hers to take, no matter what her HOA title said. But how far would I have to go to make her understand? That's when I decided, if she wouldn't leave my boathouse, I'd make sure she couldn't stay on it. And that's when things started to get really interesting. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. I had just finished a long week of work, sitting at a desk, solving problems, dealing with clients, and the thought of some peace and quiet on my little boathouse was all I needed to reset. I packed a bag with fishing gear, grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, and made my way down to Lake Serenity. It was my little slice of heaven, my getaway from the world. The boathouse wasn't anything fancy. It had wooden walls that had weathered years of rain and shine, a creaky old dock that jutted out into the lake, and a roof that needed a bit of patching here and there. But it was perfect. I'd inherited it from my father, who'd also found solace in the place. And after his passing, it became even more precious to me. For years, it was my retreat from the noise of everyday life, a place where I could fish, reflect, and just breathe. But of course, things were about to change. I arrived that morning to find something odd, a small piece of paper fluttering in the wind, attached to the door of my boathouse. At first, I thought it might be a flyer or an advertisement, but when I went closer and saw the bold words, "Violation Notice," my stomach sank. The letter was from the HOA. Apparently, I was in violation of some rules about lake access and had been reported for improper use of the boathouse. It wasn't anything new. Every now and then, the HOA would send letters about things like unsightly lawn ornaments or unauthorized landscaping. But this was different. The letter claimed that I had been violating the HOA's policies by using the boathouse as a living space and operating a private dock. I stared at the letter in disbelief. What were they talking about? The boathouse was just that, a small structure by the lake where I kept my fishing gear. There was no one living there, no guests staying overnight, and I certainly wasn't operating a business out of it. But the HOA didn't care about logic. They cared about control. They'd recently elected a new president, Karen, who had big ideas about how things should run in the neighborhood. And apparently, my boathouse didn't fit her vision of order and uniformity. I tried to reason with myself. This could be a mistake. Maybe someone had reported me out of spite. Maybe the HOA had gotten the wrong impression. Either way, I decided to call the HOA office and clear things up. That's when I got the first real taste of the nightmare I was about to step into. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. The voice on the other end sounded professional enough, but there was an edge to it, a kind of condescending tone that I didn't like. "How can I help you?" the woman on the phone asked, barely disguising the annoyance in her voice. I explained that I had received a violation notice regarding my boathouse and wanted to understand exactly what the problem was. "Oh, you're the one with the dock, right?" she asked, almost as if she already knew who I was. "You've been using it for personal purposes, and that's in direct violation of HOA rules. You're not allowed to use the lakefront for anything other than what's been approved by the board." I tried to explain that I hadn't changed anything about the boathouse or the dock. It had always been used the same way, and there was no reason for any complaint. But she wasn't listening. Instead, she just kept repeating the same line about community standards and violation of HOA policies. As I grew more frustrated, I realized that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. It wasn't about understanding or finding a resolution. It was about control, plain and simple. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. Who had complained? Why was the HOA even involved in something so trivial? And why did they feel the need to send a violation notice for something that had been perfectly fine for years? But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like Karen was the one pulling the strings. She had made it clear from the start that she wanted to reshape the neighborhood, make it perfect in her eyes. And my boathouse, my little piece of personal space, was the perfect target for her. It didn't fit her vision of what a pristine neighborhood should look like. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just about some arbitrary rule about lakefront access. It was about control. Karen had made it her mission to police everything in the neighborhood, and now I was on the list. But that wasn't the worst part. As the days passed, I started noticing strange things happening around my boathouse. First, I noticed some of the trees around the property were marked with orange paint. Then, a few days later, a construction crew showed up at the edge of the lake, measuring and taking notes. When I confronted them, they said they were there to assess the land for community development. Community development? I asked, my voice rising. What's that supposed to mean? The foreman didn't give me a straight answer, just that they were instructed to mark the property for a new project. I immediately called the HOA, but no one could give me a clear explanation. As the days went by, I learned that Karen and the HOA had been planning to build a walking path that would cut right through my property, right next to my boathouse. It seemed harmless enough, just a path for people to enjoy the view, right? But what they didn't tell me was that this path was going to be built directly over the shoreline of the lake, taking out part of my dock and blocking off the access I had to the water. In short, they were about to take away the very thing I loved most about my property. They wanted to use my land for a project that wasn't just a walking path. It was going to be an entire development area. They were going to tear down my boathouse, chop down the trees, and build this so-called path that would not only interfere with my daily life, but destroy the beauty and peace that made my lakeside retreat what it was. The most infuriating part? Karen had never even bothered to consult me or anyone else in the neighborhood. She was pushing this through without any consideration for the people who actually lived here. That was when I realized that the fight was about to get ugly. The HOA didn't care about my property rights or the years of peace I'd found in that little boathouse. They were determined to push through their agenda no matter what, even if it meant bulldozing over people like me. But I wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. This wasn't just about a boathouse. It was about standing up to an HOA that thought they could trample on anyone who didn't fit their ideal image of the neighborhood. And now, I was ready to take the gloves off. It didn't take long for me to realize that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. The more I tried to speak to Karen, the HOA president, the more I felt like I was dealing with a brick wall. I had tried reasoning with her, showing her how the boathouse was not violating any legitimate rules. But instead of discussing solutions or hearing my side, she only doubled down on her rhetoric about community standards and keeping the neighborhood pristine. After my initial conversations with the HOA, I started doing some research. I went through the HOA's charter and bylaws in detail, hoping to find any legal precedent that would back up my case. The more I read, the more infuriated I became. The rules were vague, at best, and allowed for all sorts of interpretations, many of which seemed to target things like my boathouse, which was well-maintained, unobtrusive, and never a problem for the community. But the rule book was there, and I was determined to find the loopholes that would give me the leverage I needed. While I was deep in research, trying to figure out how I could stop this walking path and preserve my property, I noticed something strange happening on the property next door. The neighbors had been living there for years, and it seemed like they were now getting calls from Karen's team, telling them about the so-called project and its timeline. I walked over one afternoon to ask them what was going on, and I learned they had no clue about the development plan until a few days ago. They were just as blindsided as I had been. It dawned on me that Karen had made a huge mistake. She was trying to force a development on the entire neighborhood without any proper transparency. I realized that many of my neighbors were just as frustrated as I was, but no one had the courage to challenge her authority. Everyone was too afraid of the HOA's power and the potential fines they could incur if they spoke out of turn. That's when I knew it wasn't just about me anymore. This had become a fight for the entire neighborhood, and I wasn't about to let Karen bulldoze everyone's rights just to satisfy her vision of a perfect community. I decided to take matters into my own hands. If Karen wanted to ignore the people who actually lived here, I would show her just how serious I was. It wasn't just about saving my boathouse anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. The first thing I did was gather the legal documents. Armed with my deed to the property and evidence of the HOA's vague bylaws, I contacted a lawyer friend of mine, Claire, who specialized in property law. She was more than willing to help, and she agreed that Karen and the HOA were acting outside of their jurisdiction. I wasn't about to let them tear down my boathouse without a fight, and Claire's expertise gave me the confidence I needed to take action. She helped me draft a formal letter to the HOA, challenging their actions and demanding they cease the proposed development. I knew this was going to get ugly. The letter was just the first step in what I anticipated would be a long battle, but I wasn't ready to back down. I spent hours at my desk, writing out my case and gathering more evidence. Every conversation I had with my neighbors who were equally affected made me more determined to take a stand. At this point, I was under no illusion about the outcome of the situation. The HOA, particularly Karen, didn't care about any of us. She didn't care about our property rights, our history with the land, or the memories we'd built in our homes. For her, it was all about control, her vision of what the neighborhood should be. I was just a thorn in her side, someone she could easily push around, or so she thought. But I had a secret weapon, knowledge and unity. Karen couldn't control the entire neighborhood forever. If enough of us pushed back, we could force her to reconsider the development, or at the very least, delay the process long enough for me to put stop to it. The turning point came when I received a response from the HOA. Karen had evidently been in damage control mode after my letter, and the response I got was not what I expected. The letter wasn't from Karen herself, it was from one of her underlings. It was a standard dismissive response, claiming that the HOA had already voted on the matter and that the decision was final. It said they would be proceeding with the development regardless of any opposition. But what struck me most about the letter was the sheer arrogance. They hadn't even addressed any of my specific concerns or the fact that they were completely disregarding property rights. This wasn't just a bureaucratic issue, it was a blatant abuse of power. They were trying to steamroll over everyone's rights, and they thought I would just sit back and let it happen. That letter lit a fire under me like nothing else. This wasn't just about preserving my boathouse or the lakefront. It was about defending the rights of everyone who had ever been intimidated by Karen and the HOA. I realized that if I didn't step up now, they would continue to get away with this behavior, destroying property and forcing their will on innocent people. The response to that letter was swift and direct. I contacted Claire again and made a plan to challenge the entire development in court. But as I was preparing for the legal battle, something unexpected happened. Karen made her first major mistake. In a meeting with some of the neighbors, Karen had let slip that the walking path was only the first step. She mentioned casually that the HOA was planning on building luxury condos on some of the other properties around the lake, which would drastically change the entire area. This wasn't just about a walking path or my boathouse anymore. Karen was trying to turn the entire lakefront into a luxury development, and she was willing to bulldoze over anyone who got in her way. It was a small admission, but it gave me all the ammunition I needed. If Karen and the HOA were planning to develop the area in this way, they would have to abide by zoning laws and property regulations. And that's where I struck back. Armed with this new information, I contacted the county planning office and got copies of zoning maps and development permits. It turned out that the HOA had been quietly seeking approval for these luxury condos without notifying anyone in the neighborhood. They hadn't even filed the necessary paperwork with the county. The development wasn't just unauthorized, it was illegal. That was the turning point I had been waiting for. I now had the legal leverage to not only stop the walking path, but to potentially halt the entire development plan. With this new information in hand, I knew it was time to go public. I reached out to several local news outlets, giving them the full story about Karen's attempts to take over the lakefront and the illegal development plans. Within days, the story was all over the local news, and Karen's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. This was the moment everything changed. The tide was turning, and I was finally ready to take down Karen and the HOA once and for all. The legal battle was about to get even more intense, and I wasn't backing down. The moment the story hit the local news, I knew there was no turning back. The phone call started almost immediately. The HOA couldn't hide its growing panic, and Karen, once a pillar of confidence in the community, suddenly found herself scrambling for damage control. What had begun as a small legal dispute over my boathouse and their proposed walking path had ballooned into a full-scale fight for control of the neighborhood, and Karen was no longer in control of the narrative. In the days that followed, the media coverage spread like wildfire. The local news outlets covered the story extensively, interviewing neighbors who were just as fed up as I was. People who had quietly suffered under the HOA's tyranny for years finally found their voice. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving, with many residents rallying behind me in support. It was no longer just about me and my boathouse. It was about the neighborhood reclaiming its power from the clutches of an overzealous HOA. Meanwhile, Karen and the HOA board were doubling down on their defense. They issued a public statement claiming that the development plan was part of a broader initiative to improve the community and bring in much-needed investment. They tried to paint me as a troublemaker who didn't care about the greater good. They called me a NIMBY, not in my backyard, despite the fact that this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had been affected by their overreach. Karen's argument was shaky at best, and it didn't take long for the community to see through her manipulative tactics. The final straw came when the county planning office confirmed that the HOA had, indeed, failed to file the proper paperwork for the development. The zoning violations were clear, and the luxury condo project had been moving forward without any public hearings or notifications. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a deliberate attempt to bypass the community's right to have a say in the development of the area. The news hit hard, and Karen's entire plan unraveled in front of her eyes. That evening, Karen sent an email to all the residents of the neighborhood, demanding a meeting to address concerns about the controversy. It was clear she was trying to regain control, but the damage had already been done. The community was on edge, and the people who had supported her in the past were now questioning everything she'd done. The email was full of empty promises and veiled threats, but it was also telling. Karen was scared. For the first time, she was not in control. At the meeting, which was held in the HOA's main clubhouse, Karen's demeanor had changed. The usual confident, almost arrogant attitude was replaced with one of defensiveness and anxiety. She began speaking before anyone had a chance to voice their concerns, trying to get ahead of the issue. She framed the whole situation as a personal attack on her leadership. She attempted to manipulate the facts, turning the legal and zoning issues into a he said, she said drama. But the residents were no longer buying her lies. One of my neighbors, Mrs. Hawkins, stood up and presented the legal documents I had obtained from the county planning office. She read aloud the zoning violations and the improper paperwork the HOA had submitted. It was a blow to Karen's credibility. The entire room fell silent as the truth began to sink in. For the first time, Karen was confronted with the consequences of her actions, real, tangible consequences that could no longer be ignored. Karen tried to brush it off, claiming that there must have been a misunderstanding. But it was clear to everyone in the room that the situation was far worse than she had led us to believe. The board members, who had previously been her loyal supporters, began to shift uncomfortably. Some of them looked at their feet, others exchanged nervous glances. It was as if the realization had hit them all at once. They had been complicit in this scheme, and now they were all caught in the fallout. I could see Karen's facade cracking. Her voice began to shake as she tried to redirect the conversation, but the crowd was no longer interested in her excuses. The meeting, which had once been her domain, was now slipping out of her control. For once, she wasn't the one calling the shots. Then, as if on cue, one of the residents, Mr. Harris, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, stood up and dropped the final bombshell. He had records showing that Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Spa treatments, resort vacations, and even a new car, all charged to the HOA's account. The room erupted in disbelief. This wasn't just a simple zoning violation anymore. This was financial mismanagement on a scale no one had anticipated. Karen's face turned white as she tried to backpedal, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no way to undo the damage. The residents were livid. They had trusted her to manage their community, and she had betrayed that trust by using their money for personal gain. This was the tipping point, the moment when Karen's empire came crumbling down. The meeting ended in chaos. The board members who had supported Karen were left scrambling, trying to salvage what was left of their reputations. But the damage had been done. The trust that had once existed between Karen and the community was shattered beyond repair. That night, I sat in my living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. It was hard to believe how far this had come. What had started as a fight to preserve my boathouse had turned into a battle for the very soul of the neighborhood. I had never imagined that Karen's greed and arrogance would lead her to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. But now, with the support of my neighbors and the legal evidence in hand, I had finally taken her down. As the days passed, the fallout continued. The press coverage intensified, and the story spread far beyond our small neighborhood. The public outrage over Karen's actions was widespread, and it wasn't long before local authorities began to investigate the financial mismanagement within the HOA. The board members who had been complicit in Karen's schemes were facing scrutiny as well, and many of them began to resign in shame. For Karen, the consequences were swift. She was forced to step down as the HOA president and was replaced by someone who promised transparency and accountability. The board was restructured, and the luxury condo development plans were put on hold indefinitely. The community had fought back, and we had won. But for me, the victory wasn't just about stopping the development. It was about standing up to a corrupt system that had taken advantage of the people it was meant to serve. It was about protecting my property and the rights of my neighbors. And most importantly, it was about ensuring that no one would ever have the power to push us around again. The aftermath of that chaotic HOA meeting and the resulting fallout was nothing short of transformative, not only for me, but for the entire community. Karen's resignation marked the official end of an era of corrupt control over the HOA, and the entire neighborhood felt a sense of relief. It was as though a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. No longer did we have to endure her petty rules or fear retaliation for simply living our lives. The air was different, freer. In the days that followed, the community rallied together to begin rebuilding. A new HOA board was elected, and this time, the members were chosen by the residents, not appointed by a handful of people with personal agendas. A sense of democracy returned to the neighborhood, and residents were encouraged to voice their opinions and concerns. I found that people who had once been too afraid to speak up were now coming forward, ready to make their voices heard. They shared stories of their own struggles with Karen's tyrannical leadership, from unreasonable fines for trivial things to outright bullying for daring to stand up against her. It was clear that Karen's reign had caused deep scars in the community, but now we were on the path to healing. Even the press coverage continued long after the meeting. News outlets picked up the story, and Karen's corrupt actions became a case study in how unchecked power within a homeowners association can destroy the very fabric of a community. It sparked conversations about HOA accountability and prompted other neighborhoods to evaluate the way their associations were being run. People were starting to realize that they had more power than they thought, and that their voices mattered. For me personally, the victory meant more than just the preservation of my boathouse or the stopping of the condo development. It meant the chance to live in a place where I could enjoy my home without the fear of constant surveillance or absurd rules. The peace and quiet I had once craved was now mine again. The ripple effects of this battle extended far beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood. The story of Karen's downfall became a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere who had been bullied by their HOA or were living under the thumb of authoritarian leadership. I began receiving messages from people across the country who had been following the story, some even offering their own experiences with tyrannical HOA boards. It became clear that what had happened in our small community was not isolated. It was a reflection of a larger issue many neighborhoods were facing. The key lesson that resonated most strongly through this experience was the power of community and unity. Alone, it would have been impossible for me to stand up to Karen and her cronies. But with the support of my neighbors, we were able to make our voices heard and take back control. It was the collective power of individuals coming together that brought about change. We realized that when people are united, they can move mountains. Another important takeaway was the importance of holding people in positions of power accountable. Karen had been able to operate unchecked for so long because residents had been either too afraid or too disengaged to question her actions. But once we took a stand, everything changed. I learned that it's not just about standing up when things go wrong, but also being proactive, staying informed, and not allowing a single person or group to dictate the terms of your life. On a larger scale, the story highlighted the flaws within the system of HOAs in general. While HOAs can serve a valuable role in maintaining property values and ensuring that communities remain desirable places to live, they can also become breeding grounds for corruption and abuse. This situation prompted a broader discussion on the need for transparency and proper oversight in homeowners associations. People began demanding better checks and balances, and I think that's a step in the right direction. Lastly, I came to understand the value of personal responsibility. When I first bought my property, I never expected to find myself in the middle of a battle against an entire HOA. But life has a way of throwing challenges at you when you least expect it. The lesson here is that no matter what happens, you have to be ready to fight for what you believe in, even if it means going against the tide. If you've ever been treated unfairly by your HOA or any organization with unchecked power, don't sit back and let it happen. Stand up, speak out, and demand the changes you deserve. Your community, your home, and your peace of mind are worth fighting for.